Greetings everyone, and a very warm welcome to the PMI Victorian History Library. My name is Lauren and I am the library's Chief Librarian. Our library is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. A brief overview of our facilities. The bathroom is located through the main doors of this room, right at the back behind you. Turn right and the bathroom door is on your left. We have an emergency exit outside the doors to my right and down to the end of the corridor, and another out the main doors behind you. In the unlikely event of an emergency, a staff member will help direct you out the building. This year we celebrate a momentous occasion as it marks our library's 170th anniversary. Established in 1854, we are the second oldest library in Victoria. We have a collection of over 40,000 items, and we take pride in being the sole library in Australia with such an extensive collection available for loan. Our focus remains rooted in local history, housing a wealth of information encompassing most towns in Victoria. Our library staff will be capturing photographs and videos during tonight's event for promotional purposes. If you prefer to not be included, please let us know. At the end of the talk, there will be time for questions. I would like to welcome Alex Wardrop, who is an independent railway operations researcher and analyst. He developed and continuously refined a train performance and signal system simulation model, which is currently used throughout Australia. Tonight he will be talking on his topic, Melbourne's Great Metropolitan Railways, which has been drawn from his book, A Tale of Two Systems, The Evolution of Melbourne and Sydney Metropolitan Railways from Federation to Pre-Pandemic. Alex, over to you.
Thank you. As was said in the introduction, I'm an operations analyst, which lies somewhere between mathematics and engineering. I've sort of worked in the New South Wales Railways, I've worked on the Canberra buses, I've been an independent transport consultant for yonks. And it was, while I was a consultant, one of the people who worked with me said, Alex, why don't you write this stuff down? And there's so much here. Please write it down. So I wrote the book. And then what I'm talking about tonight is a wee extract from this book, covering what I think is of Australia's heroic age, that period from Federation through the Great War to the Depression, and it's something I feel we should be very proud of. So, on with the motley. Okay, origins. So, Melbourne started out as a child of gold rushes. It needed something to handle freight coming in from the overseas, going through Melbourne out to the goldfields. And this is quite different from Sydney, where the plans were started, maybe 10 years earlier. It was all about sort of bringing the produce of the hinterland to the ports of Sydney and Newcastle. Melbourne's railways then developed in two ways. there was this private passenger railway that sort of ran in the southern and southeastern suburbs. And then there was the government railway that went out beyond the goldfields into rural Victoria. And we have this two lines of development. So there is the structure of Melbourne's passenger railways as they stood in 1878, at the end of the private era. You can see the government system ran out of Spencer Street, the private system ran out of Flinders Street. The big noise in the Victorian Railways was the chief engineer, Thomas Higginbottom, and he reigned up until about 1880, and he was sort of overseeing basically the rural development of the Victorian Railways. And one of the issues for him was he was trying to build a railway to the Gippsland, and the private railways were standing in the middle. And his first thought was, I'll build a new railway in a big circle around the private railways. And then sort of people said, no, not a good idea. Why don't you buy up the private railway and then we'll have one network and you'll have a cheaper route into Melbourne. Okay, after Higginbottom left, the Victorian government, or Victoria, Melbourne, entered the marvellous Melbourne era of living off the wealth of the goldfields and the burgeoning development of Melbourne as, at one stage, the second city of the empire. So the politicians in 1884 enacted the Octopus Act, which, amongst other things, prescribed 10 new suburban railways, 8 additions to existing railways. And all of borrowed money. And then to top it all, Melbourne acquired its cable tram network. So by the end of the 1880s, here is this magnificent city, all set up. And then depression struck. So the land boom collapsed. The land boom was feeding the development of suburban railways. When the land boom collapsed, the railways were built, but they had no passengers. Then Melbourne's banks began to fail, start to spread interstate. Then we had the Federation drought, just to top things off. But the construction of the suburban railways had been enacted, so they were still building these railways, even as the money was running out. And of course, there's a little sidebar to this. John Monash, your esteemed citizen soldier and founder of the SCCV, was the site engineer for the outer suburban railway. So for all of these woes, Melbourne still had a very, very busy suburban railway. In 1890, there were 59 million passengers a year for a population of under 500,000. It did fall to 42 million, or 40 million in 1895. It rose to 49 million in 1900. It was back to pre-depression levels in 1986. So Melbourne got over its depression. It got a new chief commissioner, Thomas Tate, and he was encouraged to think about electrifying the suburban railways. He even sort of asked a professor of engineering at McGill University in Montreal about thoughts and ideas. But when the reality of how much it was going to cost, he became a bit more circumspect. However, he did want to take leave in 1907. The Victorian government directed him, okay, if you're going to nick off to Europe, go and have a look at electrification projects overseas and find us a consultant engineer who can tell us about electrification. So he came back and he was a skeptic. He thought that overseas electrified railways, this is really the early stages of railway electrification. He said, they're really being built for special cases like long tunnels or under major rivers and so forth. And he couldn't see sort of how the reduced operating costs of electrification could pay for the capital expenditure of electrification. But he did hire electrification consultant, Charles Heston Mertz, I should say, and he came out to report in 1908. So there he is. He became very much an elder of the UK consulting engineering fraternity. In his report to the Victorian Railways, he did play to the gallery a bit. He said, you nice people, you've got a great suburban steam haul railway which is ripe for electrification, whereas Sydney, they've only got trams. Not worth worrying about. So he made his case for electrification was electrification would induce patronage. The extra patronage and the reduced operating costs would pay for the capital works. And at that stage, he recommended best practice, which was 800 volts DC, third rail. And this was for quite a network. In 1908, Melbourne had something like 360 route kilometres of potential suburban railway. And the network was almost fully formed. And to give you perspective, Sydney's suburban route length at that stage was 240 kilometres and still developing. So, there we go. Now, let's see if this works. No, not really. Green line shows the growth in network length over time. So you can see there's a step from 1860 to about 1880. Then a rapid growth up until the 1890s and a tapering off to 1900 or so, and then sort of sporadic development sort of thereafter. So that was the suburban. There was only one potential interurban growth, and that was out on the Gippsland line, and that was just in the 1870s, 1880s. And in 1924, there was the full extent of Melbourne's network. so including the inner and outer circle railways. The inner circle was electrified, the outer circle only partly. So, the Victorian Railways struggled a bit over this report. The commissioners weren't sort of convinced. They weren't sure whether the additional patronage would occur. And they said, but our steam railways are still coping. So the problem was, is electrification worth the risk? However, Mr. Tate did recognise that the Victorian Railways didn't have suitable rolling stock for suburban operations, and so he persuaded the mechanical engineers to specifically design a car for suburban passengers. They are what are now known as the Tate cars. Pictures later. However, the politicians waited until Mr. Tate retired, held a new inquiry, called back Charles Mertz, and he basically recommended what he'd recommended before with some sort of little twists. They also said, do you think electrification of country lines might be worthwhile as well? So he did look at that question. The only country railway that was in with a chance was the Bendigo line, but even it really didn't have enough passengers. But what Mertz did find was that if you electrified at 1500 volts with overhead wires, you could do this more economically than if you used 11 kV with high voltage, as was just being introduced in America, in particular on the New Haven Railroad out of New York. And so that's how you got 1500 volts. And that's how you got a decision by the Victorian Railways and the Victorian government in 1912 to electrify. So there is what the Tate cars looked like in their pre-electrification days. So they were quite handsome cars, but they were specifically designed to seat more passengers. They had internal passageways so people could distribute, so they didn't get crowded into individual compartments. And they had sliding doors, which meant that you didn't need platform staff to shut the doors of the trains before they left stations. Okay, what was happening in Sydney? Well, Sydney had a couple of problems. Its terminus had grown like topsy. They were into their second Sydney station. It just sort of had outgrown its site. Freight had to sort of move out and go to a new depot. It was incapable of expansion. And commissioner after commissioner kept saying, we need the railway to come into the city, because the railway was at the edge of the city. And then, we want to get across the harbour. How do we do that? So there were endless discussions and contests for designs to bridge the harbour. and they were never resolved. And then there was the battle of should we have a bridge, should we have a tunnel? Well, Sydney now has both. But this guy grew up in Queensland, took a scholarship to Sydney University, did engineering, went and worked in the New South Wales Public Works Department, was employed by the Public Works Department to adjudicate some of the later bridge contests, and he became the champion of the bridge. So they as an engineer, he wanted to build a cantilever bridge. This is the ultimate engineering goal. He eventually did. He designed the Story Bridge in Brisbane. but first he built the Sydney Harbour Bridge, or he designed and put out the tenders for the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So he basically had to accept as a fait accompli that the third Sydney terminus was a fait accompli. It was just 300 metres closer to the city, but it was in a larger site and it was capable of being expanded. So Sydney Terminal Station ended up bounded by Eddy Avenue, named after the railway chief commissioner who was pushing for a new station before he died. But Bradfield said, okay, to get passengers into the city, we have to have a suburban railway only that connects with the country railway, goes around the city. And because it has to be underground, it has to be electrified. And Melbourne has decided on 1500 volts. We'll do the same. We're not going to have a battle of the railway voltages like the railway gauges. And because of the current development of Sydney, he was going to sort of say, let's electrify the so-called inner suburban network. That's central to Hornsby via Main and Shore, Parramatta, Liverpool, Bankstown, Suffolk. And there would be a harbour bridge, and that would be integrated with the construction of the so-called City Railway. And in the early 1920s, when he saw the Hellgate Bridge in New York, he said, that's the design for the harbour bridge in Sydney. So he literally told the New South Wales government to withdraw the tenders that he'd already put out for a cantilever bridge and to reissue them with the option of an arch bridge. As I said, we got an arch bridge, and Bradfield got his cantilever, but in Brisbane. In Sydney's case, whereas in Melbourne was largely, the bulk of railway electrification was completed in 1923, and they mopped up the outer edges of the network between 23 and 30. Sydney made a false start in 1916 and 1917. They employed a contractor come financier who went bust after digging some holes around the Conservatorium of Music. And then, of course, Australia was consumed by the war effort. So it really wasn't until the early 1920s that they could come back and revisit the issues and restart the process. So Sydney got its electric railway and its bridge between 1922 and 1932. And the only bit missing was the link between Wynyard and St James across the head of Circular Quay, and they'd have to wait till 1956. But back to Melbourne, and of course, not only Melbourne was proud of what happened, the General Electric Company of America were very proud. They were the principal electric suppliers to Melbourne's electrification, because it was a really large undertaking, sort of by world standards. It was basically in place while the Southern Railway in London was still trying to get its act together. And the French railways around Paris still hadn't sort of got their act together, even though the metro was building. So what did you get? All right, as I said, Melbourne's decision made in 1912, construction interrupted by the Great War, 1914 to 1918. First train ran in 1919. Network was all in place and complete 1930. Sydney's first electric train ran in 1926. Most of the network was electrified by 1929, but they had to wait for the bridge to be finished to finish the link across the harbour. In 1932 or thereabouts, Melbourne had a network that was 395 kilometres long, of which 277 kilometres were electrified. Sydney, at the same time, had a network of 292 kilometres, but only 154 kilometres were electrified. The only leveller, if you like, was that Sydney had a more complex network, so there were more tracks. So if we look at another of these graphs, the blue and cyan shows the growth in the route kilometrage. So Melbourne was never headed by Sydney. But if we look at the track kilometres, so Melbourne is red, Sydney is green, by about the 1940s or 50s, the two networks had roughly same track kilometrage. But because Melbourne had a greater route length, it had a less complex network. So, what form did Melbourne's electrified railway take? Okay, in the 1910s, nobody could generate enough electric power to run an electrified railway. So the Victorian Railways had to build its own power station. And so by the time electric trains started running, they had a 78,000 kilowatt power station at Newport. And it was at Newport because it had to be located where there was enough cooling water for the turbines, distributed to all of the substations around Melbourne. So VR had to build a high voltage three-phase network to distribute the power around the network, and then had 21 traction substations to convert the 20 kV AC to the 1500 volts DC. And all the track had to be bonded so that the spent electricity delivered to the trains could be then directed back to the substations. And of course, one of the problems was, at the beginning of the tendering, the German AEG company had tended to supply all the traction bonds to deliver to bond the rails for the current return. And of course, in 1914, we were at war with Germany. And we had to find another supplier. And that was a big problem in getting electrification completed in Melbourne. Okay. It was anticipated that there'd be a big growth in the number of train services. And because of this, the inner portion of Melbourne's network, at the very least, had to be re-signalled. And the signals had to be equipped with train stops to allow the trains to be driven by a single person. So with a steam engine, you had the driver, you had the fireman, two people in the cab to look out for the signals and the safe working of the train. But if you only had one person, then you had to supplement that. So you had to have the train stops and you had to have the dead man's handle. So if the driver was incapacitated, the train could stop, in theory. Okay. To run electrified railway, Victorian Railways needed the rolling stock. Now, before they started electrification, they only had something like 288 carriages of old stock that could be suitable for electrification. So they had to build another 615 cars to complete the fleet, and they were the Tate cars. American GE supplied something like 400 sets of traction motors and control gear for the trains. And then Victorian Railways had an interesting thought. Why don't we go after parcels traffic? Why don't we have special trains to collect and distribute parcels around Melbourne? And so they built 5 parcel vans. And then they thought, well, why don't we also collect the goods in suburban freight yards by electric loco? So they electrified all the suburban freight sidings so that they could pick up and drop off suburban freight behind electric locos. And in all of this work, Mercer McClellan was still there. Mercer McClellan basically provided the project management for the electrification. And there's this unsung hero, E.P. Grove, who was the project manager. And I can't even find a photo of him anywhere, which is very sad. Okay, this is what Newport Power Station looked like in 1918. So this was at the time when it was first able to start generating power. And that's the inside of the turbine hall. And that's where it's all kitted out with its steam turbines. Then the power from these turbines had to be converted to DC for the trains. And so Victorian Railways had to build substations. Early on, they had this grand design. After a while, they sort of started simplifying. But you can still see that along the path of the old Inner Circle Railway at North Fitzroy. And what was in these substations? These rotary converters. These are synchronous rotating machines that converted the 25 hertz AC electricity into 1500 volts DC electricity. It's basically a big rotating switch that ran at such a revolution that it could switch the AC into DC. And they worked until they unravelled. And then they were a mess. Okay, you had to deliver the power from the substations to the trains. And so you have portal structures to support the railways, you had the catenary that supported the contact wire, and then you had the contact wire that the trains touched to collect their power. And because Melbourne has quite a wide ambient temperature range, the contact wire had to be tensioned, but not the catenary. Sydney, on the other hand, said, we've got a narrow temperature range. What we do is we'll get the hairy legs to go out and pull the wires in sort of in springtime and let them out in autumn to keep the tension. It worked after a fashion. This guy, Francis McNamara Calcutt, was the chief signal engineer, and he was the guy who brought back the signalling system that he saw in the Pennsylvania Railroad in America to be applied to Melbourne. And these are the signals that were used in the original electrification. So this is, as far as I can work out, between Richmond and South Yarra. And you can see only the far wires are up. So you can almost date this to about 1919, 1920. While most of the signal boxes were big levers, he also sort of put in place a number of miniature lever power frames, and this is an example at South Kensington. And that was, I think, almost the last power frame to be displaced by Metro. So that would have been operating up until the 1980s. There's what the swing door cars, the early suburban trains, looked like. They were narrow, the doors swung out, clobbered anybody standing on the station platform. And their last refuge was the St Kilda line. And there's a take train in all its glory, sort of running on the Glen Waverley line. And that's the glorious interior of a take train, complete polished wood, plush upholstery, nicely appointed. Sydney's trains were a bit spartan. Parcel van, in use. Parcel vans survived in both Melbourne and Sydney till about the 1980s. and really they were overtaken by road haulage. And a typical early freight train hauled by one of the original electric locomotives. And that's what crowds in the 1920s looked like.
That's what crowds now look like.
Notice everybody is wearing a hat and a coat, probably a waistcoat. They must have been stinging hot. Okay, I'll give you some more graphs. So here we see Sydney's tram patronage, Melbourne's tram patronage, Melbourne's train patronage, Sydney's train patronage, and then Sydney's population, Melbourne's population. And you can see that Melbourne's train patronage exceeded Sydney's until the depths of the Depression. And then Sydney recovered much quicker than Melbourne. Melbourne, both in trams and trains, really plateaued throughout the 1930s. So, results. What did electrification bring you? Well, went from 96 million passengers a year in 1912, when the decision was made, to 160 million passengers in 1926-27, which was the peak year before the Depression. Cable trams and other trams grew from 92 million passengers to 213 million passengers in the same period. Sydney grew from 63 million passengers to 130 million passengers. But there was a bit of a hiatus during the Great War in Sydney. But electric trams and Sydney by about 1910 or so was almost entirely electric. Grew from 267 million passengers to 347 million passengers. Only stopped by the Great War, and they took a bit of a hit during the influenza epidemic. So perhaps it is fair to say that Sydney was Charles Mertz's tram city. Okay, more results. Okay, did electrification deliver? Well, there was something like a 26% reduction in travel times from electrification over previous steam haul trains. Sydney's results were a bit nuanced because it depended whether you're looking at uphill or downhill travel. Because Sydney is a much hillier city. So Sydney's uphill performance was plus 31%, but its downhill was only plus 23%. So the Depression really stymied everybody because, as you saw in the previous graph, patronage fell to roughly 120 million passengers at the depths of the Depression. This was when Australia was experiencing something like a 32% unemployment rate. So times were really tough for a lot of people. However, Melbourne's transport really didn't recover very much after the Depression. It probably requires a social historian to try and delve into some reasons why. Sydney was showing green shoots by about 1933 and sort of recovered much better even before the start of the Second World War. The big losers in Sydney were the ferries.
Yeah.
The opening of the bridge halved the ferry patronage. At the height of ferry operation in Sydney, the ferries were carrying 47 million passengers, and they dropped to sort of easily half that after 1932. So, opening bridge depression really put the skids under the ferries. So, a little picture of the total public transport patronage, 1890 to 1940. Trains, trams, buses. Population. So you can see 1930 to 1940, the trains really sort of marking time. Sydney, ferries, trains, trams, buses. Population. Strange kink in the late 1920s in population. Yeah, population stats were a bit dodgy. Poor old ferries, there's where they took a hit. Never recovered from the opening of the bridge. But trains recovered, ferries recovered, and buses started sort of filling in the gaps in the train network. So Roa's finest hour, of course, was during the Second World War. They rose to the occasion, but the politicians never thanked them for it. It was just expected. After the Second World War, into the 1950s, people started to get private cars. They started to change their travel habits. And by the 1970s, public transport was in decline everywhere. And but just as the railways were losing patronage, the travel distances grew enormously on suburban trains. So as patronage was falling, the suburban fleets had to grow to carry the same number of people. So it really wasn't until about 1980 that things started to turn around and public transport came back as a sort of an acceptable mode of transport. So if I extend those early pictures, here's Melbourne again. Here's Melbourne in the pits, 1980. And then a steady recovery until COVID. Sydney, similar picture, although the trough was about 1970 and there was a recovery. This is the changeover from tram to bus. Here's the continued growth in population. Terrible statistical anomalies. It took a while for ABS to sort of iron the kinks out. But Sydney, just like Melbourne, has been heavily affected by COVID, still recovering. So that's the story to date. If Stephen wants to talk a little about the Australian Railway Historical Society.
Well, I certainly hope I don't bore anyone who's already a member of the ARHS, but just thought we'd summarise. We're very proud to have published Alex's book in comparing both Melbourne and Sydney's electrical railway systems and their history. No one had really put together a comparison of that kind before, and I just thought I'd quickly say that we've got 15 books. It was a small print run, but I last checked the other day and there was about 15 books still left to be purchased. So you can go to our website to purchase those very easily. A lot of you will know that the ARHS branch of Victoria recently closed. Since that time, and since many of the other state divisions broke away, the New South Wales branch has happily dropped its New South Wales buy tag and is gone back to a national outlook again. We were the first branch established in 1933 as just a purely enthusiast organisation. We're not for profit and self-funded. We're not affiliated with Transport Heritage in New South Wales in any way. You'll see a slide in a minute of our new headquarters that we've recently moved to in Alexandria, and that will be 100 metres from the new Waterloo metro station, but we're currently about 10 minutes walk from Redfern, if you're ever in Sydney. We have a cafe that is recently restocked with lots of goodies, and we have a bookshop with lots of railway books and second-hand railway books that have gone out of press a long time ago. We've got a digital archive that has lots of photos. We've just passed, I think, 1.3 million photos in that archive from right around Australia and international. We get a lot of income from consultation with police agencies and history research and things like that. We publish 2 magazines that you might have seen on the posters on either of the tables. We host events and tours every month, overseas and locally. Since the demise of the Victorian branch, we're growing our Victorian presence to serve the not just enthusiasts, but enthusiasts that are still looking for a home to take their railway interests. We have a lunch and outing group which meets monthly. What's the next tour? Is it Wangaratta, Jeff?
No, we did Wangaratta this
Did
month.
Wangaratta?
We're going to Birregurra.
Birregurra. Oh, I can't. In March, coming up. So that's very popular and they book out very quickly. I went on the Violet Town one in December and I was stunned at how many people went and the wonderful access and the meals that we got at the Violet Town site, and a lot of their shops actually open specially just for our group. So, and it's all using public transport fares. So being on the V-Line network, it was under $10. So you really only paid just for your meal. Slide? Do you have the slide?
Yes.
Oh. No? That's our building in Sydney. That's our newly renovated building in Sydney. We've just moved there from Redfern. We were kind of in a little dark alleyway and then we decided to branch out. Our focus is on history and information and on telling stories of people involved, not just actual locomotives, classes and carriages. The railway field is broad and encompasses more than just train spotting. Everyone will have a family member in their history that worked on their railways here. They were always the biggest department in any state or territory for several, really up until the 60s and 70s when corporatisation took over. And in Sydney, we're very lucky to have employers' cards up until a certain date too. So a lot of people contact us for consulting and trying to understand what the direct roles were in their families. So that's really exciting to pull out some of the employers' cards and to show people what their relatives did 3 or 4 generations ago. Our members are very interested in social history, engineering, industry and technology, architecture, construction and travel, and much more. And for more than 165 years, the railways have been an inseparable part of Australian life. History is made every day, and our mission is alive and continuous, so it's never really ending. So we're always looking to maintain a massive archive that we can keep forever and ever and digitise it so that the originals never get destroyed. You may see lots of membership forms on the tables up the front or out the back. Please take one home. We hope that there is something there that attracts you to join our society. We're always looking for new members. If you have any further questions, please ask me, but I won't keep it for too much longer. But I'll just say from my own experience, I was a Victorian member of the ARHS and I published Newsrail for some years. When I did go up to New South Wales, I was stunned at the quality and the quantity of the supplies and the research that they do up there. Very much like coming around the corner and seeing the PMI for the first time, and you're just stunned at the quality of a history research library, and that something of that standard can be maintained really in the 21st century with physical assets. So it was very much the same as New South Wales, although this is just on railways, not on social history like PMI. But after our General Manager visited in June last year, we're certainly looking at doing more events like this, as well as the luncheon tours that we operate every month down here in Melbourne, Newcastle and Sydney. So we're broadening the appeal much beyond New South Wales and have been for some time. So please take a membership form and see the posters for our latest editions. The electrification of the Gippsland line is in this month's edition of ARH. Unfortunately, we weren't able to wrestle any copies away from newsagents or New South Wales and bring them down free of charge, but that's okay. Let me know if you want to have any questions, but otherwise Alex is ready for questions for his talk.
Right.
All the graphs with all the patronage and the population, did you compile that, or did you? Where did you source your information, or did you do that, or did you pull from another?
Oh, that was a hard graft, I can tell you. Annual reports from the railways, various tramways, various government agencies. Transport for New South Wales now has electronic information sort of collected sort of off Opal. PDV does the same off the Mikey system. Really rich data that you get your hands into. I've been doing more of this data collection because I'm researching a book on railway electrification in New Zealand, and some of the reports I saw in Auckland were like this, and I thought, oh, this is such a wonderful way to summarise the information, but it meant more data collection. But as far as possible, grounded on annual reports or sort of official publications.
But you make these, like you compile all of it, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I share with Sydney University nowadays. Up back.
Yeah, you mentioned the regrowth in numbers from about 1970 in Sydney, 1980 from Melbourne.
Yep.
How much could you or do you attribute that to the lack of investment, say from about 1940s through to about 1970s in Melbourne, probably similar in Sydney, that were all in wooden bodied carriages, no air conditioning, no power doors, no nothing? Well, basically the Conservative government seemed to underinvest for that period, and it was a big catch-up.
We had Labor governments too in New South Wales. There's no difference.
The trams.
Up until the Second World War, the railways tended to be top of the pecking order in terms of government finance. Post Second World War, emphasis changed, particularly roads, housing, education, and so forth. Railways. So it was hard for railways to get money. And railways, the suburban railways were less important in terms of their survival than the country freight railways. So there was a tendency to try and put the money into new locomotives and new freight rolling stock at the expense of suburban.
So was it the David Hills of the world that turned the corner for us?
A terrible accident at Granville did that. Call Me David was instrumental, but he sort of came after the politicians realised that they couldn't not reinvest in railways because of the terrible consequences of failing to invest.
Thank you.
Oh, Alex, you mentioned about General Electric's involvement.
Yes.
Some time ago I did some research on the electrification, and from what I read in my material, Siemens in Germany were going to play a big part in the project, but come the First World War and the Victorian Railways were patient to get the show up and running, that's how General Electric got involved.
Well, General Electric won the rolling stock tender.
Yeah, I mean the substation.
Oh yeah, look, the substation equipment, yes, because the Siemens, even though it was English Siemens who attended,
yes.
You know, they were still tainted with their German their German origins. So yes, sort of American General Electric came in and scooped the pool.
Just one other thing. 2 years' time will be the centenary of the electric railway system in Sydney, and I've had reliable information the Sydney boys are planning on a big event in 2 years, in 2026, so watch this space.
Well, I certainly hope so, because I was very disappointed in what didn't happen in Victoria in sort of 2000.
We did our best.
Yes.